Okay, we're carrying on Archaeology in the Bible. Now, last week we looked at several finds that are relevant to the time of Abraham. We looked at Abraham's family tomb, the cave or field of Machpelah. We looked at the Shishak inscription where it speaks of the enclosure or the field of Abraham that was in the Negev. And then we also looked at the 5 cities of the plains, probable 5 cities of the plains, Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar, Admah, and Zeboim, represented by these cities east and south of the Dead Sea. And when we ended, I was explaining some of the limitations on finding archaeological evidence of Israelites in Egypt during their 430-year sojourn there. So from 1876 to the Exodus in 1446, they're there, but there are limitations on what are you going to be able to find that you can pinpoint and say this is Israelite. And so I wanted you to see some of those. I pointed out that Abraham, he came from Mesopotamia, and then he and his descendants, they lived in Canaan for over 2 centuries. So we oftentimes don't appreciate that. They're there for 215 years before they moved to Egypt. And I also noted that this is long before the giving of the Mosaic Law. That's not going to come until after the Exodus in 1446. So the cultural distinctives of Israel that are created by that Mosaic Law, those things are not available at this early date to help identify them as Israelites. So you can't look for those kinds of markers. And on top of that, the Israelites would have been open to adopting Egyptian culture because the Egyptians had treated them very kindly when they came in. And then also I pointed out that they were engaged in idol worship in Egypt, which would further blur the cultural distinctiveness. So I'm just trying to get you to be reasonable about what can we expect to find there. You say, well, how about documentary evidence? How about written things that say, hey, here are the Israelites here in Goshen? And the problem with that is, you remember, here's Egypt, the bird's eye view, and you see the green triangle there up at the top. That's the Delta region. Now I'm going to zero in on that. That's where we're going to be focused. Because the Israelites, they're concentrated in this damp eastern Delta region called the land of Ramesses in Genesis 47:11, and a number of other places called Goshen. And because of the environment there, the climate, it makes it very unlikely that any papyrus writings are going to survive. In fact, in 2012, the archaeologist James Hoffmeyer, he reported that in over 35 years of excavating at the delta site of Tel El Daba, that Manfred Betak and his team had found 0 papyri. And the same was true of Edgar Push's team in about 25 years excavating at the adjacent site of Cantir in the delta. So no papyri, and the reason is it simply disintegrates. Where you find papyri is in southern Egypt, in the arid region. And so it shouldn't be surprising if we don't find writing saying, hey, here are the Israelites among us. You say, what about carved monuments, inscriptions on monuments, attesting to the presence of Israel in the Delta? But it would be surprising to find references on monuments to foreign inhabitants, especially inhabitants who eventually become slaves and those who are associated with the humiliating defeat of the Exodus. Right? And even if such inscriptions had been made at one point, you can imagine that they would be systematically removed and destroyed, as was done in the case of Queen Hatshepsut, which we'll talk about later. So it doesn't surprise me, the absence of inscriptions saying, hey, Israelites are here among us, and the absence of papyri, that shouldn't surprise us. Now, I say all that to kind of set the expectations. What can we reasonably look for as evidence of Israelites here in Egypt? And with those limitations in mind, the excavations that were done at Tel El Daba, and here is Tel El Daba right here. You see that dot there? excavations that have been done there, they are far more significant than is often recognized. Douglas Petrovich, an archaeologist I mentioned last week, that he says that Tel El Daba, that site has been excavated more than any site in the entire ancient Near East. So there's been a great deal of work done there. It was excavated in 1885 for one season, 1941 to 42. It was excavated in 51 to 54, but the real work started with the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak. He excavated there from 66 to 69, and then from 1975 to 2009. So he worked there a lot, and now the work there is continuing at that site under the direction of Irene Forstner Mueller. So this site has been just very well excavated. And what the excavations have discovered is that Tel El Daba, this site was occupied for centuries, and during that time, those centuries, it expanded. So it starts off fairly small little village, and it expands eastward, and it goes by different names. Through the centuries, the names of the city, the village changed. It was Rawati, then it was Avaris, then it was Perunefer, and then it was Ramesses. All the same site, simply names are being changed through the ages. And the excavations at this site show that in the mid-19th century BC, okay, so right around the time, Scripture says that Jacob and his family moved to Egypt, right? 1876, excavations at the site in the mid-19th century BC. They show here that there was an influx of people from Canaan to this location. Where did Abraham's family live for 2 centuries? Canaan. And here's an influx of people from Canaan to this site. And the people from Canaan who inhabited this site, this is important, they're sometimes referred to, or oftentimes referred to in literature as Asiatics. Now that's not how we think of Canaan, but they're often referred to as Asiatics. And Asiatics, that was a kind of catch-all category that the Egyptians used for inhabitants of what is known as the Levant. And here you see, you see the Levant here. So Canaan and Syria and Phoenicia, but it also included, according to the Egyptians, included Mesopotamia in there, at least parts of it. So it's the Levant and Mesopotamia. It was a catch-all category for the Egyptians, for people who came from those areas. But the Asiatics at Tel El Daba, there are, for various reasons, they are understood to have come from the Levant, okay, from that region that encompasses Canaan. So these Asiatics, and get that in your, understand who they are. They're people coming from Canaan, and they're there at Tel El Daba. And so that Levant encompasses Canaan, and of course that's, as I say, that's the land where Abraham's family lived. And so, okay, so here they are, but they call them Asiatics. Manfred Bietak describes this 19th century BC site here at Tel El Daba. He says it was a settlement, Tel El Daba, this site, constructed at the beginning of the 12th dynasty, and completely resettled by Canaanites from the 12th dynasty onwards. And the archaeologist Douglas Petrovich says, no Egyptologist or ancient Near Eastern historian disputes that Asiatics from the Levant settled at Avaris late in Dynasty 12 and persisted there for centuries. So just to remind you, right? Here is Dynasty 12. They come in here in 1876 and then expand. So they all recognize that, quote, Asiatics from the Levant, from Canaan, they come here and then they remain for centuries. So right here at this place, at Tel El Daba, the archaeologist Bryant Wood, he says of the 19th century BC settlement at Tel El Daba, he says about 82 acres in size, It was unfortified, although there were many enclosure walls, most likely for keeping animals. The living quarters consisted of small rectangular buildings built of sand bricks. Neutron activation analysis indicates that Palestinian-type pottery from the village originated in southern Palestine. And BTAC notes that the presence of handmade cooking pots is evidence of a nomadic, a wandering, pastoral, shepherding population. He further observes that these foreigners could not have settled there without Egyptian consent. So as you know, when Joseph's father, he's allowed, they have permission to go and settle where they settle. Now, about 20% of the pottery that was found at that settlement was of Palestinian type, and 50% of the male burials included weapons of Syrian Palestinian type. People were often buried with things they were associated with in life. And so half the male burials included weapons of Syrian Palestinian type, not Egyptian. And Clyde Billington, who is a professor, a former professor of ancient history, he says about the four-room houses that were discovered in 19th century Tel El Daba. These four-room houses, they discovered quite a few of them there. And he says, for one example of the archaeological evidence of the existence of Israelites in Egypt, an example Petrovich cites, BTAC has excavated four-room houses at Tel El Daba, also known as Avaris and Ramesses, dating to the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, and only Israelites are known to have built four-room houses. Incidentally, many four-room houses dating to the Iron Age, which is a little bit later, have also been found in archaeological excavations in Israel. So we find a number of four-room houses in 19th century BC Tel El Daba. The only people we know that used that architecture for houses were Israelites. And we find them when we look later in Israel of four-room houses. He says no other ethnic group is known to have built four-room houses. The presence of four-room houses in Egypt argues conclusively for the presence of Israelites in Egypt during the Middle and Late Bronze periods. And here is the architecture. This is that. Now you could build on top of that. You can have, like the back, have another story on it. But this is the architecture of the four-room house that was known, is associated with Israelites. So you have that there. And the largest building that was excavated at 19th century Tel El Daba was this palatial residence. And they at one time thought that it was a palace, but there's no throne room. And so that rules it out as a palace. So it's this palatial residence with twin master bedrooms. And here are the twin master bedrooms right here. 1, 2. And so it has twin master bedrooms. Now it's plausible. I think I wouldn't be stronger than that, but I'll at least say it's quite plausible, as Douglas Petrovich argues, that Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born and raised in Egypt, right? His sons are born and raised in Egypt. It's quite plausible that they moved to Rawati or Avaris, that they moved there when their grandfather Jacob, near the end of his life, claimed them as his own children. And you see that in Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 and 6 and verse 21. So he claims them as his children. And it's quite possible that at that time they then moved to Avaris, where he was, arguably, and I think makes good sense. They then moved there, and it would also be strategic because they would then, as people who'd been raised in Egypt, they would then be there to help Joseph's brothers acclimate to Egyptian culture. So in any event, if that's right, when Jacob claims them as his own, if they move there, then that would make perfect sense that this would be their place and it would be their residence. So that large house would most likely be theirs. Here's what Petrovich says about it. The constructional reality of twin master bedrooms makes little sense in the case of an ordinary resident, even an affluent one. Yet it makes perfect sense if the building was the joint residence of two incredibly wealthy brothers who arrived at the site simultaneously and from the beginning built the structure with both of them in mind as primary residents. If Ephraim and Manasseh moved to Avaris, just as Jacob was dying or soon after he died, one easily can envision them leveling Jacob's Asiatic house, this four-room house, then for sentimental reasons splitting the position of their bedrooms directly over the middle of where their deceased grandfather's house once stood. So the bedrooms are split right over a four-room house. And so, these things don't come with labels, but Petrovich is just thinking and saying, if this is Jacob there, and if he then dies, it would make sense if they level that and build their house centered right on his. And then you have the twin master bedrooms there, which would go along, which is an oddity. Okay, now some of this obviously speculation, but it makes sense. Now there was in this village at Tel El Dab in the 19th century, they excavated and unearthed a large statue. This statue is about 1.5 times life size, and it is a statue of a seated Asiatic dignitary. A seated Asiatic dignitary. This statue had been deliberately destroyed. Somebody had taken a hammer to it. It had been deliberately destroyed, and fragments of the statue were found in different tombs. But we don't know where the statue originally was positioned in the place, because it's been broken all apart and stuff thrown everywhere. We don't know there, and we don't know for sure why it was destroyed, although I have some speculation about that. Here is what the archaeologist Bryant Wood says about this statue. The likeness was of a seated official, 1.5 times life size. It was made of limestone and exhibited excellent workmanship. So this is a high-end deal. This is an artist working on this. This isn't something, cobbled together. This was a real piece of art. It says the skin was yellow, the traditional color of Asiatics in Egyptian art. It had a mushroom-shaped hairstyle painted red, typical of that shown in Egyptian artwork for Asiatics. A throw stick, the Egyptian hieroglyph for a foreigner, was held against the right shoulder. The statue had been intentionally smashed and defaced. Now here is a proposed reconstruction of the statue from the fragments that were recovered. You see, you got the head, you got the right shoulder, you got the hand with the throw stick, you have down here these other fragments. And here is an illustration by archaeologist David Graves of that statue, what he thinks this statue would have looked like. And so there you see this statue of this person there in color and looking like that. Now, archaeologist Petrovich, he argues from the likely dating of the statue, from the reign of Amenemhat III. So from the dating, that he says this statue, I can narrow this statue down to being in the reign of this guy. And from the fact the statue was of an Asiatic, the fact the statue was made in honor of a deceased person. Now, he infers that from the fact there was able to be recovered from that statue a fragment from which he could read incense, which was part of an offering formula for the dead. So he says here's a statue that provides for an offering formula for the dead. So it's a statue that was made in honor of a deceased person. And then also the fact Jacob's body was taken to Canaan for burial, which would have created a sense of loss among the people at Avaris. So he takes all of these threads together and he says that this is a statue that was created in honor of Jacob. And you sit there and go, no, wait a minute, would such a thing really happen? Would the Egyptians care about that? Well, you recall that Jacob was held in very high regard, not only by the Israelites, but by the Egyptians. Right? When Jacob died, the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. You see in Genesis chapter 50, verse 3, when Joseph took his body back to bury it in the family tomb there at Machpelah, when he did that, he was accompanied on that journey. Joseph taking Jacob's body back, he was accompanied on that journey. He's taken his body back by all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land. That's in Genesis chapter 50, verse 7. And the Canaanites, they said of the lamenting over Jacob that they heard at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is grievous mourning by the Egyptians. And you see that in Genesis chapter 50, verse 11. Now, Petrovich, he suggests that Jacob, he would have been the leader here. Joseph obviously has been elevated in the government, but here comes his father. And he would have been like the de facto leader of the clan that was there in the Delta in Goshen. And Petrovich suggests that he was appointed or at least given some type of administrative role because of that position. Okay, that would certainly be possible. Now, the Asiatic community here in 19th century Tel El Daba, it grew very quickly from the initial settlement there in the middle of the 19th century, and it grows and spreads out eastward. Now, the presence of Hebrews in Egypt around this time, a bit later, but still a couple of centuries before the Exodus. The presence of Hebrews here in Egypt, it's corroborated by what is known as the Brooklyn Papyrus. This is a papyrus which was discovered in Egypt, and it dates from the 17th century BC. Okay, so they come here. You have this influx of people from Canaan to Tel El Daba in the middle of the 19th century. Here's this Brooklyn papyrus from the 17th century, would be 1700 to 1600, somewhere in that range. And the archaeologist Titus Kennedy says of this Brooklyn papyrus, a section of this papyrus contains a list of 95 servants, many of whom are specified as Asiatic or coming from Western Asia, primarily Canaan. The servants with foreign names are given Egyptian names, just as Joseph was after he was promoted from a household servant under Potiphar to the role of vizier over all Egypt. The majority of the names are feminine because domestic servants were typically female. Approximately 30 of the servants have names identified as Semitic, meaning they come from the family of languages known as Semitic languages. And he says, but more relevant to the Exodus story is that 9 of these servants have specifically Hebrew names. Therefore, this list is a clear attestation of Hebrews living in Egypt prior to the Exodus under Moses in their earlier period of residence in the country prior to their total enslavement, and perhaps shows that a group may have migrated south or was taken south for work. Now, around 1668, okay, I hope you're kind of following where we are. Like I said, we're going to move chronologically. So around 1668, a different group of Asiatics, a warrior group known as Hyksos, or sometimes pronounced Hyksos. But this group in 1668, they occupied an adjoining area to the northeast. So here we have Tel El Daba, it's expanded out. So now in the northeast section, you have this other group of Asiatics, and they seized control of the government. They took control of the entire government of northern Egypt, and they served there. And this area, by then they named it Avaris. And so they took control of it, and it served as the center. This Avaris served as the center of the Hyksos dynasty, these Asiatics who come in 1668, who take over. And it serves as their headquarters, their stronghold, their citadel, complete with a palace, a substantial palace that the Hyksos built there. And the Hyksos and these earlier Asiatics, Israelites, who had been there before, and then here come the Hyksos, and they take over control. So the Hyksos and this earlier group of Asiatics, they coexisted. And they prospered together there for approximately the 108-year rule of the Hyksos of northern Egypt. And that rule of theirs came to be known as the 15th dynasty of Egypt. That is the Hyksos rulership of northern Egypt, or lower Egypt. Then around 1560, Amos, sometimes Amosi, I've called him Akmos, but Amos around 1560, he's a ruler from southern Egypt. Okay, so he's down here. He's a ruler from southern Egypt. Well, he succeeded after a war in removing the hated Hyksos from power. And he destroyed their citadel at Avaris and expelled them from Egypt. And that marks the beginning of the 18th Egyptian dynasty. So that begins when Amos succeeds in expelling these foreigners from rule in Egypt. And at that time, the Egyptians, they then began building their own royal citadel over the ruins of Avaris. So they had destroyed Avaris in this war that they expelled the Hyksos in. And now they have plans to make it their citadel. And it's going to be replaced. And they do that, and it eventually becomes their stronghold, and from which they launch many military campaigns into the Levant. The Egyptians do. But here we are. This is at Amos in 1560 when he succeeds in getting rid of the Hyksos. Now, the ancient historical sources, the written sources, say that they agree that the Hyksos were driven out by the Egyptians, by Amos. They were driven out and they retreated to a place called Sharuan, which is in Canaan. So it's in southwest of Jerusalem. They went there. It's near Gaza. But some Asiatics continued to occupy the area of Avaris. So the Hyksos are expelled, but some Asiatics continue to occupy this area. Here's what Petrovich says. A strong case can be made for the occupational continuity of a part of Avaris' Asiatic population after the political break caused by Amos' conquest of Avaris and his eradication of the Hyksos dynasts and initiation of Egypt's new kingdom. The new kingdom began with the native Egyptian rule of Dynasty 18 immediately after the expulsion of the Hyksos. A comparative study of the material culture of the late Hyksos period and the early New Kingdom at Tel El-Daba and Tel Hebwa shows unbroken continuity that continues into the Thutmose period, which Bitak defined as the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. All of this can be accepted as true beyond reasonable doubt. For example, after the political turning point when Avaris was seized by Amos, the cultural mix of ceramic production at the site, which was typical of the Eastern Delta, continued unbroken until the Thutmose period. Archaeologically, this is indisputable. Asiatic cultural continuity is attested at Avaris before and after the transition from Hyksos to native Egyptian rule in Avaris and the Nile Delta. Okay, so you have the Hyksos are defeated, they're expelled, but there is a continuing Asiatic presence in the area. Now, Manfred Bitak, who's the excavator there for many years, he attributes that cultural continuity. He attributes the continuing Asiatic presence at Avaris to Hyksos people who remained at Avaris after the Hyksos dynasty ended. Okay, but that claim is contradicted by the historical sources that insist, all of them, that the Hyksos had been driven out. They had been driven out. And it's also based on questionable arguments that he makes, and he doesn't account for other evidence that suggests that the remaining Asiatics are non-Hyksos Asiatics, or more specifically, Israelites. Here's how Petrovich concludes his discussion of this. He says, therefore, after taking all this material, cultural, and epigraphical evidence into account, non-Hyksos Asiatics clearly predated the Hyksos at Avaris, beginning with Dynasty 12, and outlasted them at the site during the first half of Dynasty 18. And the evidence presented earlier in this volume demonstrates that their true identity is Israelite, those who descended from Jacob according to the non-fictional account of their origins recorded in the biblical text that Moses wrote no later than 1406 BC. I like Petrovich. You see, but that's how he sees it, and that's how he's reading what is going on. Now, it seems most likely that Amos is the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Most likely, the Pharaoh who's mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Now, it's possible that he literally did not know of Joseph because Joseph had been dead for about 245 years. And he is from southern Egypt. He's from Thebes, which is a long way from the Delta. In fact, it's 380 miles from Tel El Daba. So it's possible he means this literally, that he did not know of Joseph. But the verse may simply mean, it may be figurative and mean that he didn't know Joseph in the figurative sense that he didn't recognize any obligation or any responsibility to Joseph and his people. You see, it may mean that. Now, having just overthrown the Hyksos, right, these foreign rulers who were hated, had ruled over a century, and who were Asiatics. Well, having just overthrown them, you can see how Amos might be concerned that the non-Hyksos Asiatics, who are still in the Delta, that they might be persuaded to side with the Hyksos in the event of further conflict. Well, what if these guys go and they want to come back? What if there's a counterattack? What if, So you can see him being concerned, because these are Asiatics, non-Hyksos. And the Hyksos are Asiatics. I'm a little queasy about this, right? World War II, we put Japanese people in camps. Why? We were unsure. Whatever you want to think about that. That's what's driving it. And I can see Amos having some kind of a similar sense, and that fits very well with the Pharaoh's rationale for enslaving the Israelites that is given in Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, where it says, "And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they get even bigger. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and take possession of the land." Now you see the little brackets. That's because I've changed the ESV. I'll explain that in a second. Your translation will probably say, "Go up from the land," with the implication they might leave the land. I don't think that's right. Okay? So go up with and take possession of the land. Therefore, they enslaved them. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. So that bracketed phrase, that's based on the arguments of an Old Testament scholar, well-known Old Testament scholar, Douglas Stewart. And his argument that this Hebrew phrase, which is rendered literally, go up or rise up from the land. Right? That is its literal meaning. But he says that its use here ought to be taken idiomatically, that has to do with, quote, people rising up over the land, that is overcoming, overwhelming, or dominating it, end quote. And in fact, you say, well, is that legit? Is that a legit idiomatic meaning there? Well, in fact, you have the same phrase is used in Hosea chapter 1, verse 11. And when it's used there, the New Revised Standard Version, in fact, translates it, take possession of the land. So the NRSV recognizes there that it's the proper rendering there would be idiomatically of taking possession of the land. And the note in the New English translation to Hosea chapter 1, verse 11, it says, alternatively, gain possession of the land. See the New Revised Standard Version. Or rise up from the land. This clause may be understood in two ways. Israel will gain ascendancy over the land, that's how in a footnote the New Jewish Publication Society Bible has it at Exodus 1:10, gain ascendancy over the land. But it says Israel will gain ascendancy over the land or conquer the land. And then one of the examples they give for that meaning is Exodus 1:10. Okay, so it's not crazy. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think the point is, now this is part of what makes me think that's the right way to understand the phrase in this context. And part of it is I don't think the point is, look, we must enslave them or else they will fight with our enemies against us and leave the land. I don't think that's what's being said. I mean, the Israelites they'd been in Egypt for centuries, so if they hadn't been enslaved, they presumably would have remained there. But if the Israelites sided with Egypt's enemies and defeated the Egyptians, well, it seems to me they'd be happy to have them leave. And if the Israelites sided with Egypt's enemies and the Egyptians defeated that coalition, well, then they wouldn't be able to leave unless the Egyptians wanted them to, because they'd be prisoners of war. So I just don't think that's what's being said here. If you take the clause idiomatically, then the focus is not on the Israelites leaving the country, but on their defeating the Egyptians and then ruling the country with their coalition partner. That's what I think is being said. That's what I think is the concern. That's why they enslaved them, because of that fear. Now, if the Asiatics at Avaris were enslaved after Amos defeated the Hyksos, as I think happened, then they probably, or they may have been relocated to somewhere around there, because they're going to keep them there. They need that workforce, because their intention is to redo Avaris as our own citadel, and they build huge palaces there. So they need that slave labor, and they're also going to turn the site into a store city. So they need that slave labor. And so they could have been relocated to somewhere right around there. Now, if I'm right, if it was Amos who enslaved the Israelites, well, then the time of their slavery in Egypt was about 114 years. Now, see, I know how you are. You're thinking, well, doesn't Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 preclude that? Doesn't Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 say specifically that the Israelite slavery was 400 years? It can be read that way. I don't think that's the right way to read it. I think the way it ought to be understood is what's reflected, for example, in the New International Version, where it says, "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years." Now, what do I think is going on here? The precise time of Israel's sojourn in Egypt is 430 years. That's the exact time. We know that from Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 and 41. So I just think this is an approximation. This is a rounding. So God is saying that in the future, know for certain that for about 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. That's going to be the total period of your being in a foreign land. And they will be enslaved and mistreated there. I added the brackets, for some unspecified length of time. You see how that works? The Christian Standard Bible is the same in meaning. It says, "Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for about 400 years in a land that does not belong to them." So he's they're going to have this long sojourn, this long period of incubation in a foreign land, and will be enslaved and oppressed, without specifying that the slavery and the oppression will encompass the entire time. Now, can you read it the other way? You can. And many of your translations no doubt do. I'm just telling you what makes the most sense to me and why I don't think Genesis 15:13 makes impossible what I'm telling you. I don't even think it makes it unlikely. Okay? So I just know that you'd want me to say something about that, because I know how people think. All right. Avaris, you say, well, what kind of a concern? You know, Avaris is a fairly small place. I mean, they've grown there and gone eastward, but that's not the only place where the Israelites are. You say, why are they so concerned about this? Well, Avaris is only one of many delta cities where these Asiatics may have resided, okay, in the narrow, fertile band that's known as the Wadi Tumilat. Okay, it's this band, I have it up here in red, from the easternmost tributary of the Nile and going eastward. In that place, that little fertile band there, 21 of the 71 sites that were excavated in that Wadi Tumilat band there yielded materials identified with the Levant from 1800 BC to 1550 BC. Okay, so we now have, over here we have this. Canaanite remains were found at a place called Tel Mashkuda, right here. You had Canaanite remains were found there at that place from about roughly 1830 down to 1750. And it's also clear that there was an Asiatic element that resided at a place called Tel El Yehudieh during from roughly 1800 to the time of the Hyksos expulsion in 1560. Okay, so we have more presence here of Israelites. And interestingly, that name Tel El Yehudieh, that's Arabic for mound of the Jew. And so that may reflect, some kind of faint memory of an ancient Jewish presence there. There was a nearby cemetery near Tel El Yehudieh, which was from 1700. This cemetery was used from 1700 BC to 1600 BC, roughly, and it contained ceramic remains of a Palestinian type. And that cemetery was thought by the archaeologist Olga Tufnell, to be a burial site for, quote, a poor community of shepherds. Okay? So you see, Pharaoh's going, there are a lot of these people around. Okay? And I want you to see there. So there is significant circumstantial evidence supporting an Israelite presence in Egypt during the time the Bible puts them there. Right? Significant. Bryant Wood, the archaeologist Wood, he points out that archaeology has provided evidence of, quote, the right culture in the right place at the right time. Right? We have Canaanites in the eastern delta during the time of the Israelite sojourn described in Scripture. Now that's mighty coincidental. Right? That's mighty coincidental. And speaking specifically of the site Tel El Daba, Bryant Wood says, without identifying inscriptions, you see, without the smoking gun, we'll never know for sure if the Strata D2 people were Israelites. This much we can say, however, the finds represent exactly what we would expect to find from Israelite occupation in Egypt. Okay, now you're oftentimes told, that's just crazy. That's just, there is no Israelite presence in Egypt. That's just nonsense. Okay? But I'm telling you, we're in a war, right? Information stuff. You get told everything. And particularly stuff, anything that'll make Christianity and the Bible look bad, that's sold as fact to you. Okay, so we're trying to dispel some of that here. Now, the bell's going to ring in 43 seconds, so dare I start about Pithom? And the answer is probably not, but I can't help myself. Oh, okay. The store city of Pithom, right? Mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, that these Israelite slaves, they were forced to build. Now, that store city is thought by many to be here. Many scholars think it's this site right here, Tel El Rataba, right there. They think that is Pithom, and they think that for a number of reasons. And that site was excavated by a Polish and Slovak team from 2008 to 2017. And it was discovered that around 1600 BC, so right near the tail end of the Hyksos rule, around 600 BC, the bell rang, and I'll pick up next week, Lord willing.